Once people start to feel more hopeful, they feel like they can find meaning in their work. They start to rethink the everyday daily tasks that might feel mundane. And we need organizations to also attach what is valuable and what is meaningful to us as individuals so that we can then play that out in any way that we need to. It needs to be autonomous. I need to be able to say, I don't mind answering this 700th email because I know that it's actually going to end up in this final opportunity for this person to maybe get promoted. If we feel hopeless and lack purpose, all of those tasks just lead to bore out, where we feel like we just hate our jobs. We're exhausted, we're tired, we don't care, we're rage applying, looking for other jobs. That's what happens when we detach value to the daily tasks.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. When we think about fixing burnout at work, we often talk about purpose or work design or leadership, but my guest today says the real starting point is hope. And not vague optimism, but cognitive hope, which is a measurable, buildable skill that gives people the agency to set meaningful goals, create multiple pathways to achieve them, and take small steps forward even in the most uncertain times. Jennifer Moss is an award-winning journalist, workplace happiness expert, and the author of The Burnout Epidemic. And she's back on the show with her newest book, Why Are We Here? It's a companion to her last book, and it shifts the focus from diagnosing what drains us to building the human foundations that allow us to thrive. In it, she explores hope, purpose, community, compassion, freedom, openness, and belonging, what she calls the foundations for leading in a future of work that is constantly changing. In our conversation, we talk about why hope comes before purpose, how hopelessness is showing up in workplaces around the world, how micromanagement kills hope, the language of permanence as a warning sign, and how leaders can move from empathy to compassion by taking action on what they hear. All right, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And now, here's my conversation with Jennifer Moss. Jennifer Moss, welcome back to Work for Humans.
I'm so thrilled to be back. I had such a pleasure speaking with you the last time. And I think even after we closed off, there was so much more discussion that we had, even after the podcast finished recording. So I'm looking forward to more of that today.
Well, you've written now what I see as the companion piece to your last book. And so your last book was The Burnout Epidemic. And it was all about what are the attributes of work that burn us out. And this, your most recent book, I'm seeing it in galleys. Is it published yet?
It doesn't come out till the 21st of January.
Okay, so we're close. By the time this launches, it'll be out. So your most current book, Why Am I Here? Such an existential title, but it's very much about really why am I at work? And it's the antidote to burnout in many ways. And so I think you were writing it the last time we spoke. I think that I was starting to get hints of it in that conversation. And so how has the journey been from the last book to this one?
It's been such a journey. The other two books, Unlocking Happiness at Work and then The Burnout Epidemic, were very specific. Unlocking Happiness at Work was around psychological fitness, a lot of, Sean Akers stuff and Seligman stuff. And my work on the Happiness Council played a lot into what that book would be about. And then we went into, the pandemic, but I was writing about burnout beforehand because we talked about this. I felt a little bit like a fraud and being part of the toxic positivity trend that was happening based on everyone now talking about happiness. It led me to burnout because I had burned out as well. And I felt like we needed to talk outside of burnout. People were feeling burned out about talking about burnout, which is unfortunate because it's still very ever present. It's a real problem and there's catastrophic impacts from it. So we can't stop talking about it. But there I was really talking about institutional changes, policy changes, systems changes. And I feel like this book now, Why Are We Here? And we can talk about the reason for the existential title in a second, but I think that this journey of taking me sort of the pendulum swung really far with the burnout epidemic. And I wanted to come to a place of saying it's not hopeless because that's what was starting to happen. This level of cynicism that happens when people burn out, it's a natural symptom. So we're really just all experiencing this symptomatic result of chronic stress. And we need to work these muscles out and really rewire back to a place of humanity, of simple kindness, of psychological fitness, and developing emotional intelligence inside of organizations again. And doing that with a whole different behavioral mindset of a workforce that's completely changed, like paradigm shifted, totally new future of work, the multiverse of work that we're in right now. So, this is why I created this narrative now for us to shift into the next decade of trying to lead in these times.
I was very interested in the order in which you address topics in this book. And so the order is hope, purpose, community, and then compassion, freedom, openness, and belonging. And what surprised me was that hope came before purpose. And I'll tell you why it surprised me, which is I thought that purpose would be the grounding and hope would be a necessary component of having purpose. And yet you start with hope. Why?
There is a condition right now that's happening inside of not just within our organizations, within our own selves, but globally, this level of hopelessness is leading to a lot of really profound future impacts. For example, and this one really struck me, and it was why I started to understand people's malaise, their languishing, what Gallup is calling the great detachment now inside of organizations. It's a human problem. If you take countries right now, South Korea and other countries that are funneling money into improving the fertility rate for couples, young families, they're suggesting things like 4-day work weeks and how do we incent people to family plan because we're in really big trouble. We're not going to be able to be sustainable from an economic standpoint in the next 20, 50 years. And when you actually drill it down, and it was a great piece in the Atlantic that kickstarted this research and thinking for me. But when you research and interview people that are talking about why they're not having children, yes, financial well-being is part of it, making sure that we're not burned out. There's a culture of overwork, especially women are extremely overworked. They're more likely to burn out than others. But what couples were saying anecdotally, and I think this is very telling, is they were saying, I don't really want to bring children into this world. And that statement for me is at the crux of so many issues. You cannot put a carrot to change that. And at work, you cannot motivate people with pay like we used to in the same way. We can't get people to feel engaged if they do not see a future of themselves in that organization, in the world of work at all. They don't see themselves wanting to bring children into the world. How are you going to motivate them to think, these young millennials and Gen Zs, how do you get them to be encouraged to be engaged and think about their future and feel excited about your mission? So if we really look at it from a purely economic standpoint, hope is critical, even though we try to make it sound like it's flighty or a wish. But hope is also making people feel like the goals that they're setting are achievable, that they have agency and autonomy to reach those goals, that they have power over uncertainty. And hope builds that kind of cognitive resilience inside of times of high uncertainty. So we want to do that in our workplaces because there's going to be an economic trickle down effect for young people that feel like, okay, this is a world that I feel like I can see myself in. And organizations play a role. They don't play the whole role.
There's these different paths to better work in general. And one of them is we need to change how companies are organized. And then one of them is we need to change how leaders behave. And then one of them is we need to change how people think, essentially, which is that we have to go into how people are approaching work. The context of, you call it polycrisis in the book. It's interesting because, so first of all, when I was a kid, we had like 3 really big looming threats. And one of the threats was overpopulation. And everybody was very worried about that. Now we're worried about demographic collapse, which is fascinating, right? Because we can worry about too many people, we can worry about too few people. Another real concern was we're going to run out of oil. We've reached peak oil, and there's not going to be any more oil. And now we're worried we're not running out of oil fast enough. Because if we could just run out of oil, we could slow down global warming. And the other one was a nuclear threat, which we just kind of forgot about, I'm going to say. It's not that it went away. It's weird. The SALT treaties came out, and we were like, we can only eliminate everybody on Earth 5 times now instead of 50 times. Everything's better now. And we just forgot about it. We just basically forgot about it. And so it's almost like hope is a different search algorithm, which is the idea that hope is, I'm actually going to look for the things that are hopeful because there's a lot of data that's very hopeful. Most things actually are getting better. And yet our search algorithm is set for despair.
It's so fascinating that you say that because there was a big part of the book that we ended up stripping because it didn't necessarily make sense. But now that I have these conversations, I feel like maybe we should have kept it in. And I analyzed the Google search, and the big trends report came out, and I dug into that. And in 2021, where we still felt like the crisis was acute. And there was this point where we had this sense of, okay, we're over it. There was a point where we all went back. There was this couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, where people were feeling, in North America, very specifically, and the UK, where things were going to be over. And when you started to look at the Google searches, it was like, how can I help? What can I do to support this real pro-social behavior came out of that first 6 months? Everyone was in. And then over time, you started to see over the last 3 or 4 years, the shift in the things that we're looking for, the things that we're searching for. And it's changed. And you can really tell, you have an understanding, a deep understanding of this. But what was so fascinating to me, even into 2022 and 2023, these slight shifts in what people were looking for. But our first reaction in an acute moment of crisis, even 6, 7 months in, we were still looking to be there for each other. There was a sense of community and support. And that is what I think has been a big part of the behavioral shift, is the length of time we've been in this state without recovery, without a real adjustment, without a rethink. It's just been business as usual, try to keep plugging along, and there's a fatigue. And that fatigue has never been addressed. And so I think that when we don't address this hopelessness that's been driving us, and we don't address the disconnection, we're not fixing it, then we're only going to continue to see those search algorithms, those algorithms of hope, decline. And I think that's really worrisome. We need to be paying more attention to that.
What do we know about hope? What's the research? How do you get it?
It's one of my favorite psychological traits to develop in organizations. And I've had lots of talks where people are like, okay, I've changed my mind. Hope is a strategy. We always say hope isn't a strategy, but I've had lots of people say, actually, you've changed my mind. I can see it. And the reason is that empathy is a very difficult skill to teach someone. Leaders that have empathy, it's usually highly genetically baked into them. There's that idea of born more on that high empathy ability that's natural to them. You can build it, but it takes a lot of time. And some people, it's very difficult for them to build it. But we always talk about empathetic leadership as the number one soft skill that we need to be building, this essential skill. But cognitive hope is actually a way that we can build empathy, and it's easier to do. You really have to look at Snyder's theory, and he talks about hope theory as a set of essentially 3 pillars. It's all about having a goal in the first place, really critical. We need to have a goal. And then having the resources to be able to get to those goals. And that means planning. So what do I need to achieve that goal? Do I have the people around me that can support me? Do I have the autonomy to be able to get to those goals on my own? And creating plan Bs, plan Cs, plan Ds. The more we create different pathways to access those goals, the more likely we are to achieve them. And we're not so married to this is the only way to get there, which is why we can't have micromanaging inside of organizations. It's the death to hope. And then the third thing is that we need to just feel like we have the empowerment, we have that support system. And why I wrote, actually, I feel like I'm just propping up Google in this conversation so much here. But one of the things I wrote in the book is just the transparency around goal setting inside the organization, setting plans to be able to achieve them. And a lot of it is supported by peers, peer support and helping us achieve our goals and creating accountability to that. And also celebrating small wins. When you are in a state of depression, a therapist will say, just get out of bed. That is building hope. Just taking a shower, that is building hope. And making your bed. These simple things are how we build cognitive hope. Inside of organizations, we spend a lot of time celebrating the big wins. And when we're burned out, we spend less time celebrating each other and thanking each other and making a point to be happy about something we've done. It feels like right now it's just move on to the next thing, go to the next thing. Even Gen AI is supposed to be helping us to finish our jobs faster. And the way we measure productivity is completely counter to that. So you finish your job early because you're efficient and you utilize Gen AI and its benefits. Well, let's give you more work instead of sending you home and giving your time back. And so I think we need to rethink what is our goal, what matters around goals. Why are we micromanaging people's goals? And how do we make it so that people feel like they're winning every day and not feeling like they're losing constantly?
There's one term that you've used. You used it in the book and you used it here. Cognitive hope. It just makes me want to ask, what is not cognitive hope? Apparently, that phrase is setting it against something. What is it? What, I guess, hope of the endocrine system? I don't know what, if it's not cognitive, what is it?
Well, and it's a really good question. But when we talk about this in psychology, it's really this idea of it becoming baked into moving from a state. So a state of being where you're practicing hope, maybe you're making your bed and you're feeling a little bit better. But when you move it into a trait, then you're not practicing it in the day to day. It becomes a part of fluency in your behavior.
I see.
And it's kind of like the state of gratitude. You practice gratitude, but you're not grateful until it becomes who you are, until there's a fluency in it. And it's a natural way of feeling. And so I think we have a desire to feel hopeful, and there's hopeful moments in our lives right now, but we're not actually fluent in hope. And that's why right now it's easy to move back into a negativity bias. That's our natural way of behaving anyways, is we're looking for the threats. So if we build up and are more frequently in states of hope, then we can become hopeful people and a hopeful society. But it requires effort and practice and intention, and organizations actually building this into their strategies and systems. But when that happens and you have a more hopeful culture, I mean, imagine what that looks like, a hopeless culture versus a hopeful culture. If you're looking to innovate, if you're looking to be future focused, competitive, it's night and day, the difference between people that feel hopeful. They're going to stay longer. They're going to see themselves in the future of the organization. They're going to put more in. And right now, because humans are feeling hopeless, leaders are struggling to figure that out. But that's what they need to understand, is it's a different tactic than what they're using. Their heuristics that they're relying on for leadership is really a bit old school. If we look at old school being 5 years ago, it's now obsolete. So this is what they need to be understanding about the behavioral mindset of their teams.
I'm going to read a line you have, and then I have a couple of things to drill into. One is hope theory tells us that hope is not a mere abstract concept, but a quantifiable psychological construct. It serves as a powerful antidote to uncertainty. That's really interesting to say uncertainty as opposed to despair, for instance, which it is also. But that uncertainty is one of the things that puts us into stress. So, a powerful antidote to uncertainty by equipping employees with emotional resilience and determination to persevere through tough times. I sometimes on the show have spoken about the story we are in, and I had John Truby on the show. He's a scriptwriter, and he wrote the book called The Anatomy of Genres. So we spoke a lot on the show about what story we feel we are in. And it seems like a really big role of a leader in encouraging hope is to tell a story that can have a happy ending. Is this a global issue right now? Is this data coming through, this hopelessness? Is it happening everywhere? Most places?
It's interesting that you asked that because it's not everywhere. There's places where you look at the global World Happiness Report, and Gallup World Data did a really good job of asking different questions in the last few years, even just, do you feel like you have someone you can count on? They haven't asked that before, but when you look at the data, especially around youth and hopelessness, the lower that score is, Canada's a great example. We're in the top 20 always. But if you look at us as if we're a happy country for youth, we end up falling down to the 60s, I think, of happiest countries. We're like 63rd. And that's because youth in our country are not feeling like they have someone that they can lean on. That's a perceived state. So you don't need to test that. You just need to have a perception that someone would be there to bail you out of jail, for example. You just need to believe that if there was ever a situation where you needed it, they would be there. And so you're seeing that vary across the country, across the generations. And when you see that increase, people feel like they have social support, their hopefulness rises and their hopelessness declines. There's also another example. I look at Riyadh. I'm in there speaking often, Saudi Arabia, and they have a new mindset around 2030 goals and women empowerment. And they have the whole country. Everyone's just so embracing this idea of progress, and they feel like they're in it. And their sense of hopefulness has increased considerably, especially when you look at comparisons between the Gallup data then and now. So I think a leader of a country needs to rally people to see that there's potential for everyone to be included and engaged, and people can rely on each other. And we can't take for granted in places like the biggest, most profitable, strongest OECD countries actually being the place where we feel the least hopeful. And so there's a point that we need to be looking at around other countries and looking to them to see what is it that they're doing that's building social cohesion, because that is actually a big part of hopefulness.
What's interesting about that is that in the structure of the book, community comes later. But what I can see is that all of these things are related to each other, which is that feeling that you have a purpose is very tied to hope and vice versa. But community is the third section there, and that is about anti-loneliness, feeling like you're not alone in the fight.
I always look at things in this way of, and this is the same with the burnout epidemic, what's the hygiene that we need to look at first? And hopelessness mimics depression and anxiety, and it can be very antisocial. And so if you can't get yourself out of bed because you're feeling hopeless, or you don't want to talk to other people, it's creating a high level of social anxiety. We've seen social anxiety increase from around 4 or 5% of the global population dealing with social anxiety to around 37% that are self-reported now with social anxiety since the pandemic. So you need to have a hopefulness to get out and to see people and build the community. So you need to have some of these things. It's almost like they all intertwine, but there's a stacking of the lowest place that we can be and how we need to overcome these in stages. You build hope, you feel more like, well, maybe I deserve friends and I can have friends, and these friends will be lasting, and maybe they will be there for me. And so we need to start stacking some of these things and starting with what the first part of the book, I put it out into 3 parts. And the first part of the book is foundations. We need the foundations of changing our way of being human and being human with each other. That foundational piece cannot happen, and we cannot solve big business problems if we don't have that first.
hope, purpose, community. These are the foundations of moving forward.
Absolutely. People too, once they start to feel more hopeful, they feel like they can find meaning in their work or they can see the meaning in their work. They start to rethink the tactics that they're doing every day, the everyday daily tasks that might feel mundane. You feel more hopeful and then you start to see, okay, I feel like these tasks actually are building up a bigger picture in my organization. These things that I'm doing aren't for nothing. I have value. I'm effective. And maybe this thing feels like it's not important, but I have a hopefulness. I feel now that there is meaning. And we need organizations to also attach what is valuable and what is meaningful to us as individuals so that we can then play that out in any way that we need to. It needs to be autonomous. I need to be able to say, I don't mind answering this 700th email because I know that it's actually going to end up in this final opportunity for this person to maybe get promoted, or maybe it means that this person is going to be able to own their own home, or maybe it means that this kid in some vulnerable part of society is going to be cared for. But if we feel hopeless and lack purpose, all of those tasks just lead to bore out, where we feel like we just hate our jobs. We're exhausted, we're tired, we don't care, we're rage applying, looking for other jobs. That's what happens when we detach value to the daily tasks. I mean, most of the stuff that we do, I love my job, but there's a lot of tedium in the job too. You can enjoy your job, but you have to be able to look past the tedium that's part of work every day. And if you lack purpose and hope, you completely live in this when am I going to get out of here mentality.
I have to admit, I haven't quit jobs very often in my life, but every time I have, it's been because I've lost hope.
That's a really interesting point.
And it's really hard for me to lose hope. I am like the most stupidly optimistic. Things have to suck a lot before I'm like, this is never going to work kind of attitude. But would be very interested to see the degree to which hope and exiting are correlated. And I think they are. I just had Ethan Bernstein and Michael Horn on the show talking about why people quit. And it was very much about, I need to leave this place because it has nothing left for me anymore. And I have hope that the place I'm going to go is going to have something for me.
Yes. And I think what's really fascinating too, that happened with the Great Resignation, is that people were feeling that lack of hope in their organizations. They were saying things like, my employer doesn't care about me. They're using words of permanence, language of permanence. It's always going to be like this. It's never going to change, which that means that you feel like you can't fix it. Like your hands are completely tied and someone else is making those decisions for you. And so that language of permanence really started to spike. And then there was this great resignation. And what happens in our network research, the contagion research, social contagions, once you quit once, it's like divorce. If you divorce once, the second time, you're more quicker to say, this isn't working for me. Whereas what you saw for a lot of people 22 years in, they didn't have that frame of reference and there was a fear, but an existential moment facing your mortality, and that on a global scale had everyone saying, well, what's there to lose? Life is short. So I'm going to do this now. And I feel hopeless. So all these things happen and it created this mass resignation event. And then now people have seen, especially those loyalists, those ones that the traditionalists, those ones that have stuck it out, will be more quick to leave or to disengage, whatever it is that would hold them there before. It's not the same for those people. And so that network effect has really also played a role, the contagion effect of quitting. And so this, again, it's just creating this whole other paradigm that a lot of employers and leaders, they don't really know what to do with.
I really like that, listening for the language of permanence. I've never heard that phrase before, language of permanence. Is there a phrase that's the opposite of language of permanence? I guess it's language of transience.
Well, it's a more hopeful language. You don't use I's as much. You don't feel as isolated. So I as two, you start to see more of people talking about themselves. And That's actually the language of isolation, really, that I. And when we see actually people feeling more hopeful, they'll look at it as impermanent. So it's fleeting. This is frustrating me right now, but I know it's going to get better. Accountants know that they have compressed workloads at certain times of the year. Teachers know in June they're feeling really disengaged, but they're getting the summer off. We see that attitude where their predicted job satisfaction is going to improve because they see this as impermanent and they use different language. But when you start to use language that is like, this is just how it is, I cannot change it, then we can guess that someone is in a place of likely quitting or feeling like they're hopeless at work.
That's something I've coached people about at work, team members and others, which is when things are really bad, the important thing to know is that they're going to get better. When things are really good, the important thing to know and to prepare for is that they're going to get worse.
Yes, it's true.
But the reason is things trend toward the mean. And so things can't always be fabulous. I mean, it's just unlikely. On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. So is there a relationship between despair and expectations? Do we expect too much? Do we go through periods of hope where we think everything's going to be great and then we are shattered? What's the relationship to expectations?
There's a lot around managing expectations. And when you look at a lot of the Eastern religions, they talk a lot about just letting your expectations of everything go. You can't have any expectations of anything. And that's living a true, happy, healthy life, is not to expect anything of anyone. But I think there's a balance there. I think it's important because we need to have expectations of how people treat us, and we need to have expectations of being cared for. There's social contract that we've created with work and government and all the people that are supposed to be looking after us. So it's fair to have expectations, but I do think that the expectations have changed. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we didn't know any of this other stuff before. We just went into work 5 days a week. We did what we were supposed to do. It was more of a transactional relationship. It's only really been since the invention of the car phone that we took work outside of the office, right? And now the car phone allows us to work in our cars. And then it became the cell phone or the Palm Pilot that allowed us to work everywhere, all of these innovations. So it's a fairly new thing when you look at the office being 550 years old. This is a new shift, but we've gone through this shift from transactional relationships to social relationships with people inside of our world. And what that means is that you can't go back, especially trying to jam the toothpaste back in the tube around people's flexibility and their ability to work anywhere and their decision to move. And there was promises that were made with what Gen AI was going to do. All of these things that were promises became broken promises. And so the expectations, when they changed, are increasing this sense of hopelessness because it was an agreed upon decision that was made. It was a contract that was made between people. And so now people see the things that used to be perks are now rights. This is my right to be able to have this. I've demonstrated that I could work productively in this way. I've demonstrated to you that I can have this flexibility and still be a high-performing person. I've shown you this. You've made a promise to me. And so when those expectations are clawed back or told that they're unreasonable, it creates a very rebellious spirit in people and in the workforce.
Thanks for letting me spend so much time talking about hope. It's like 1/8 of the book, but it's something that I agree with you is so foundational it's worth talking about. I want to go on to purpose, though. It's partially because we say purpose. This is another one of those words where I think we say it like we know what it means. And I think I don't all the time. And I feel like there's purpose with a big P, which might be the whole company purpose or the strategic purpose for me. And then there's with a little p, which is I'd like to answer all my emails today or something.
Yes.
What do we know about purpose? And do we have better definitions of it?
I drilled into this too in the book, just that difference between purpose and meaning, and really looking at purposes. It's more about what your terminal goals are. Like, what are the things that you want to do in your life? What do you want to achieve? I want to be a good mother. I want to leave a legacy of actually impacting people, maybe being that 1% reduction in burnout somewhere in some organization. The big things. I want to cure cancer. So that purpose of who we are needs to tie directly into the meaning of what we do. So the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, that's where the meaning comes into those tasks, so it can fulfill our big values, the big goals that we have of our lives. And every person has something. And it can be, my purpose is to really just be able to put my kids through school. And that's what makes me a great dad. And so driving this Uber is so profoundly a part of my purpose, because it is doing the thing that I care most about, which is giving my kids a better life. And so anyone can really attach their purpose to the meaning of the day-to-day things that they do. And it's something that we need to discover in ourselves, that we need to figure out what it is that makes the thing that we do meaningful and then attached to our greater purpose. And then organizations can do a better job of saying, what matters to you as a human being? What do you really care about in the world and in life? And how do I make sure that you know in the day-to-day things that you do, by storytelling or by sharing the impact, by talking about how this thing that you do translates into something, that can do good. Those are the things that we need to do as leaders, is figure out what matters to people, because we're so driven to live up to the things that we really care about, but we're not as driven by a mission statement, for example. That's the purpose of the organization. That's their big, hairy goal. So we try to, often employers and leaders try to drive the mission as this thing that we all are attached to. And yet instead, if we get people to focus more on just how it's attaching to what they care about, then people will naturally be driven towards the mission, because it's the work, it's the job itself that matters to them and what they do as part of their day-to-day role. So that's really manager-led, that's team built. You need to have leaders giving autonomy to managers to be able to figure out what that looks like and what that is, and be able to work within that space. There's a lot of freedom that managers need to have to figure out what that is, but you can find that out about anyone. That's the gray data that is shared in those conversations that you have in non-work related discussions. And you find that thing that makes that person tick, and you have that person for life. And so we try to create these massive overhaul strategies that are very expensive, and it's values changing, and it's a big internal communications campaign. And really, it's just a manager asking a few questions like, what lights you up? What stresses you out? And as a team, what can we do to make next week better?
Those are a nice 3 questions.
3 questions. And you can find out what stresses someone out. They might not be as vulnerable right away, but over time, if you ask that every week on your Friday before you head out, or Monday to start your week, whatever that looks like. But if you do that consistently and frequently, and you build up that trust so people can be vulnerable and say, actually, this is what stresses me out. You build up that psychological safety, you build up that hope, because you're getting quick wins once a week. And then you can learn what someone's purpose is, what their values are, and then drive motivation around their purpose and their value.
That sounds very similar. So you said, what lights you up, what stresses you out, and there was a third one.
What can we do together as a team to make next week easier, next week better? It's like incremental wins. You're developing social cohesion. you're building community. It's altruism, which is the one well-being strategy that works inside of organizations, if you look at Oxford research. And it also is a motivation, a purpose and motivation strategy exercise.
Can you say a little bit more about altruism contributing to well-being?
Really excellent research out of the Oxford Wellbeing Institute. It came out, and I think it should have been all over the media. And it was for a short while, and then it sort of dropped off, and people do reference it, but it was an incredible research paper that Dr. William Flemings wrote. And he had been working under Jan Emmanuel Deneuve, who's an economist, really well-known happiness economist. He really focuses on well-being, and he's part of the global well-being happiest countries think tank that works on that. And what Flemings came up with that I think shocked a lot of people is he kind of had that headline, none of the well-being programs that you're investing in are working. And it's much more nuanced than that. It's not exactly true, but it really showed that a lot of what we invest in, like anti-bias trainings and unconscious bias trainings, also resiliency trainings, a lot of the well-being programs that we think are to improve workers' experience of their life and work, the only one that really did make an impact and a significant impact was altruism. So both altruistic behaviors, so focusing on benevolence, like helping other people, doing things for other people, creating strategies where there's peer support, you're being mentored, there's a buoying of each other. And that culture of that inside of organizations was a excellent driver of well-being. And then volunteerism played a big role too. When there was a heavy commitment to volunteerism inside of an organization, he said basically you build up that as much as possible and you're going to see significant impacts on well-being. And that's also hygiene being managed. Like it's hard to be well. And this was one of the things that he really, I think, was interesting is he found that for executive women in this one cohort, they looked at specifically executive women that were receiving resiliency training were less well when they went through the resiliency training. There was some programs that had a detrimental impact. And part of that was because they were talking about not having time. And then you see well-being as workload and you're taking this resiliency training. And that means you have to work in your evenings and weekends because you took time out for this resiliency training, which is forcing you to have to be more resilient. And it's your organization's fault that this is happening. So it's kind of like just constantly pulling people out of the river instead of preventing them from falling in. So he was demonstrating that when you really want to fix a broken culture, get people to be kinder, get people to volunteer, and look outside of their own needs.
I want to mention that one of the things you referenced, and you've referenced twice, but we haven't said it out loud, is the 4th annual Mental State of the World report. And it is something that comes out, I believe, of Oxford and the expert that you were just citing. And it's where some of the trends that you're mentioning about young people in Canada are coming from and things like that. And you also mentioned hygiene. And one of the things that it talks about is financial stress. And I thought it's very interesting. One of the things that you called out in the book is that there's a bidirectional link between finance and mental health.
Yes.
If you want to expand on that, it would be great. Can you say something about the bidirectional link between finance and mental health?
Well, when people have jobs, they're more mentally healthy. I mean, we see that they're just financially healthy. But then also when people have issues with mental health and they're dealing with mental illness, it's very difficult for them to get jobs. So the thing that would improve their mental health, it's very difficult for them to access. And so we see this group now, we're seeing it specifically in America with white men in this group between 18 and 34, where they are not just becoming underemployed, but they are moving into an environment where they're being completely removed from the workforce. They're not being able to be trained in a way that's going to help them to be successful. They're being overlooked and ignored. And what we're seeing is this high increase in substance abuse and in interest in groups that are radicalizing this generation of people that are feeling very lost to the workforce. And what happens is that we see high levels of mental illness, but also just high levels of catastrophic impacts from that. Really, it's leading to suicide, and we're seeing a drop off of this group. And I think that we need to look at having a sense of hopefulness of being able to be in a job and having access to employment as being a major strategy when we're looking at dealing with mental health. And we bifurcate a lot of our strategies, especially when it comes to policy. We're looking at unemployment and employment, like just very specifically over here in a silo, and then mental health and managing mental health over here in a silo. And we're not realizing that underemployment and unemployment and completely feeling like you've been removed from the workforce is not just very dangerous from a mental health standpoint, but it's creating all these other impacts to our society when it comes to violence and violence against women and all these other things. So one of the things I think why this book was so broad and I had these 8 categories and it feels like, oh, that might be a lot. It's because it's this way of linking these issues together and understanding that it has to be more of a broad way of thinking about these problems as all interconnected. And we don't do that very well. Even in our organizations, there's so many silos between people and culture and human resources and leadership, and even just some of the stuff I include in the book around the CFOs now really being involved in culture. And it was never the CFO that was looked to engage in culture discussions. But the CFO is getting more involved because they understand that the financial part and the way that they can think about that from a strategic level is very interconnected. And when we lack financial well-being, we lose so many people.
It's one of the discussions that I get into sometimes. And the reason I wanted to talk about the financial well-being, you actually introduced me originally to the work of Frederick Herzberg and motivation hygiene theory. And the big ideas there are paying people what they're worth on time. I'm going to say predictably, mentally safe. I know what my job is, and I have access to the tools and resources to be successful. That was Frederick Herzberg. And tell me if I'm right about this. The idea behind the hygiene concept is, look, these are the fundamentals. You don't have these, you don't have anything else. You need to have these things. These are the foundations upon which you build to higher levels of, I'll say, motivation. So then when we talk about things like hope and things like purpose and community and compassion and freedom and openness, would you say that the hygiene things need to be taken care of first and these others build upon that like a hierarchy? Or would you say that they're deeply intertwined?
When I talk about hygiene, I'm talking about all of these traits, essentially, the psychological fitness traits. We need to have those at least to a place of people feeling like they're not being harmed. So we can get to a place of neutral where it's not necessarily that we're super hopeful, but we're not hopeless. There's a place where it's like we're content in these places. And that's really where the hygiene motivation 2-factor theory that Herzberg was really focusing on is that there's a continuum, but there's also a division in that unless you have some of these things as table stakes being managed, then you're not going to be able to see the other stuff, your high performance, your engagement. People can be neutral, they can be productive enough. But if you really want to see a high performing organization, you need to be able to have hygiene managed first, and then you look at high performance after. And so when you look at the traits, we're talking about fundamental human needs. It's like Maslow and just what we need. If we don't manage hopelessness, there's never going to be a point of optimization. If people don't feel like they belong, they can't have a shared vision. You can't actually get people to share the same vision when they feel excluded from the rest of the group. If people feel like they're not recognized for their work, they feel, what's the point? There's this rise of what's the pointism. And so this is why we're seeing specifically women opting out of the workforce entirely. And we're seeing the narrowest pipeline for executive female professionals that we've seen in decades. You have to have that sense of community, feeling like you can rely on someone. When you look at the data again globally, people that felt like they didn't have anyone that they could count on then they're more likely to be the least happiest country in the world. And so this is all foundational to being able to optimize. It's funny because I'm writing now, or just in that now production of the 10-year update on unlocking happiness at work, and it goes out in a few months. And what was so fascinating, and I'm reading some of the stuff that I'm saying around how we need a certain level of emotional intelligence. This is foundational. If you want a happier workplace, this is what that looks like. And, I'm citing research from 2010, and I'm back here, 2024, citing research from today. Everyone's talking, the World Economic Forum, the most important critical skill that we need in 2025 to be globally competitive is a soft skill, is analytics and creativity and the ability to be empathetic and compassionate. These are, again, like the biggest survey going out, and everyone's talking about it. We keep talking about the same thing. And it always goes back to why work isn't working and why it's getting worse. Because no one, that's hyperbolic, but a lot of organizations are not doing really foundationally resetting. And I know it's a lot of work and it doesn't feel as quantifiable, but there's lots of ways to measure outcomes now. There's so many well-being measures. There's lots of ways that we can measure retention and attrition based on whether we improve people's well-being. So this idea that we can't measure it as a business outcome is long gone. So that's an argument that has to be gone. But I think that, we just have a hard time resetting that mindset.
One of the guests that I had on the show, Anil Gupta, when I asked him, what does your job cost you? One of his answers was, I go on stage and I ask people to pass me notes anonymously about the challenges they're facing with belonging. And he said, one of the greatest costs of my job is having to know that when people are anonymous, they tell you things that are so hard. So it was an interesting thing that the emotional labor that he faced in how he responded, and he would try to respond to those questions, but it's very challenging.
It is, especially when they come to you after and they're crying, especially with the burnout conversation. And why are we here has been, I think, a little bit more joyful of a topic because it feels more hopeful. But I would have a lot of times where I'd have someone come up and they would be crying and they'd be desperate and they'd feel like it was their fault. And I would end up being the therapist in that moment, which is not my skill set. I can offer strategic advice for leaders, and I can, as a human, and as a caregiver, and my personality is to be empathetic, I can care for you, but I'm not going to give you the right professional responses. And so that's a hard part.
Right. It's not the right time to say, let me tell you what the Oxford study on well-being says.
Right. Here, I can give you an academic study. I know the data on this. It's just not the time. You're just hugging them.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about altruism and well-being. One of the most common answers I get to the question, what job do you hire your job to do for you, is I hire my job to help others. And it takes two forms. One form is I want to help people directly. I want to see the impact I make. And the other one is I want to change how the world works so that it helps people in the way that the world works. For them, that's the definition of a good job. It's one of many attributes, but it's one of the attributes of good job. And so there's a way in which what the study that says that altruism at work is the path to well-being is to some extent saying high quality work is the path to well-being, because high quality work for many, many people is work that allows me to help others.
I love that you said that, because when we think of altruism or helping, we have this very specific thought process around how it helps people. And it's usually thinking about a NGO or the UN or Red Cross. That's altruism, or donating money or fundraising. But when you talk about that specific goal of producing good things and helping people in whatever capacity, that could mean anything. That could mean Gen AI. That could mean lots of different things. And even just products that work better, that are more effective. I think of all the medical devices or anything that we put our effort towards. And it's, I love, and I interviewed her, Anita Williams-Woolley from Carnegie Mellon, and she worked on a lot of the stuff around psychological safety. And she looked at the collective intelligence of groups, and she found that the collective intelligence improved when people were able to rely on each other to make something really good, to hit the goal or to be effective. And then they developed relational energy and community based on their shared effort. And so I think that when we look at altruism, it's just working together for each other and for the goal of supporting each other in that goal, and it not just being for your own needs, for your own benefit. It's about looking to get other people ahead. It's to making sure that other people are shining. It's to give people the time inside of a meeting to speak up instead of you taking all the air in the room. There's lots of ways that we can be altruistic professionally. And it really is just more so thinking about your colleague than yourself.
I once did a study, I've spoken about it on the show before, where I went out and I inventoried everything in people's cubes with the idea that how you modify the out-of-box experience of work might tell us something about what's missing or what's good about it or something like that. And so one of the most common objects, and by the way, this was super invasive.
Good self-awareness, I guess now. Yeah.
I felt it at the time. I mean, it's public. It's a public space, but you're scrutinizing it in a way that they probably didn't intend. So you go in a weekend and you look at what's there. And thank you notes to them was one of the most common objects, especially thank you notes with lots of signatures.
That's so cool. I love hearing that. That's a neat study.
And that's because on a hard day, I figure, they could look up and they could say, sometimes I make a difference.
Yeah, you would feel like that. It's this recognition in the thank you piece. O.C. Tanner does a lot of work on recognition and research on that. And they're finding that when people don't take time to say thank you inside of cultures, it's really detrimental. But a culture of recognition has this massive impact. And your peers are really important to that. Your boss, there's obviously you want to have a healthy, productive relationship with your boss, but your peers highlighting you is just so important. And when you're busy and when you're, like I said, when you're stressed and burnt out, you're not great at lifting your head up to say thank you to people, and it gets taken for granted.
In the second half of the book, you talk about compassion, freedom, openness, belonging, and recognition. We just spoke about recognition. The one that I really want to dig on there is compassion, and in particular because the second half of the book is very much about how leaders need to approach this opportunity or this problem space. And so you describe the need for a compassion strategy. I've never heard that phrase. What does it mean?
We use the term empathy a lot, empathetic leadership, and that's been really important because we haven't done a lot of the active listening that's required. And we're doing more of that. I still think there's a lot more that has to be done because the way that we actively listen, we think we'll do that through a looking back survey or engagement survey. It's not really working. Real active listening is what I talked about with that question that managers have to ask: what lit you up, what stressed you out, and what can we do for each other? That's active listening. But compassion is actioning what we've heard. That's the next step. So you're empathetic, you're listening. But what if listening only goes to the point of, well, I can't really do anything about it? Compassion is, here's how we're going to test and iterate and make change and work with you to show that we're listening. And there's been a lot of lacking of compassion just as a result of the speed that we're moving. And technology and AI is a big example of that, is that a lot of leaders and employers aren't realizing that there's a lot of anxiety around AI. Then there's a lot of mistrust around AI adoption and technology. There's also a lot of uncertainty about what that looks like for lots of different workers. We're seeing younger workers for the first time be more afraid of becoming obsolete than our mature workers. There's been this rise. And that is just, again, the hopelessness. So we need to foundationally deal with that. But it's also just a lot of leaders not actually knowing what the strategy is. And so they're making it up as they go along as well. We need to stop and just take a pause on all of the integrations that we're doing in general and trying to really make sure that it makes sense and that people feel communicated to about why this decision is being made. And then also being reassured that they know what their place is in this growth stage or this progressive stage or this future of work that everyone's talking about, but they don't really know where they fit in. And so compassion is, okay, how do we get people readied? How do we make them feel future ready? This is a lot of where the upskilling and reskilling, solving those big problems come from, is actively listening to what people need, knowing where they're at, meeting them where they're at, and then making sure that there's pathways. We're seeing a lack of succession planning with Gen Xers, for example, which make 50% of the managers. There's just not this succession planning for them. So they're also feeling like, why are we making these decisions? They're also more likely to be a wait and see kind of generation, whereas millennials and Gen Zs are like, I need to know now because this is so critical to the rest of my career and my life in this moment. So I think that compassion, when we're looking at strategies to, when it comes to any sort of adoption, a lack of that, it just makes people feel completely terrified of losing their jobs. They're afraid to speak up when they lack the knowledge. I mentioned this, like Gen Zs, for example, we have this complete expectation of them that they know everything about technology when it comes to AI. They're so digitally nascent that they're going to come into work, they're going to know everything, and they should just be able to pick up on something really quickly, and not understanding that maybe that's not the situation for everyone. And that mature workers, they're getting overlooked for training consistently because we have a bias that they're not interested, or they can't keep up, or they're not technically savvy. And so we think of reverse mentoring always as the Gen Z training the boomer on how to use tech, instead of looking at it like, who is actually the most equipped? How do we get everyone to a place where they feel like they are readied? How do we use different types of people in the organization to be able to train and support and offer peer mentorship? It doesn't need to be reverse mentorship. It could just be peer mentorship between people that really have a good sense of the technology. And then really laying out the plan, even if you don't know it. If you're a manager who has no idea, you need to do the steps to figure out how you can reduce that anxiety for people. And compassion works for everything. Compassion works across the board. If you ask any one of your employees a question and you get an answer from them, in any relationship that's productive and healthy, there's a response. There's a way that we respond to each other. In nature, there's always that response that happens between species. But what happens when a species doesn't actually feel like there's a response out there, that they've put their call out and it's gone to the wild and it's not been responded, they will feel alone. And that is what's happening inside of organizations that are asking questions of their employees and not giving them answers. Their employees feel alone. And that's what we need to reshift again in that behavioral mindset. Going back is to giving people an answer, even if it's, I don't know exactly, but I'm working on it. And this is what the plan is for me to get that information to you. That is what we need to be doing. And a lot of people are feeling like they don't know what's going on. And it's creating a lot of uncertainty.
What do you say to leaders who say, I've tried to do good things for employees and they're still complaining? If you hear that.
I do hear that a lot. And there's a real cynicism that leaders are feeling right now. Like, I'm doing everything. But I always ask them, how often are you having conversations, real conversations with your employees? And I don't mean as a mental health professional. I get that they're in these stages right now where they're feeling like, oh, if I open that box, then I'm going to be there for hours and we're going to be going into something that I can't solve. And I get that. But I think it's really about giving people the ability to make choices in their career and in their plans. And we're not spending as much time individually creating bespoke pathways for those employees that want to feel hopeful. Instead, it's like we're using old frameworks. We're really using old heuristics because that's what we know. And a lot of leaders are actually of the generation of mine, Gen X and boomers. Most of the leadership are in that age demographic where It's completely different than millennials and Gen Zs and how they grew up professionally and what their expectations are. So what I see, and that's the openness chapter, is that we're saying over here, I'm doing everything I can and they should just deal with it. I told them to come back to work. This is a job. That's what the expectation is. Why are they disengaged? This is what they should be doing. And we're repeating the same things that we used before as tools for motivation that are just not working anymore. And then we also see then our younger generation feeling this huge rise of ageism. The American Psychology Association said ageism is the last socially acceptable prejudice. And I feel like that's so true. I mean, when you look at headlines that say, oh, boomers are so annoying, they can't Google. And then you have boomers saying, if millennials just stop buying avocado toast, they'd be able to afford a home. It's like super funny. And we can roll our eyes as Xers or boomers and be like, Gen Zs are so entitled. And we have this favorite term that we want to label everyone with. And it's really creating this lack of compassion. We're just able to then say, we've tried everything. We've done everything. And we really haven't, because we feel so cut off from our other generations and we feel so alone in each one of our generations that we're not listening and we're not actively compassionate about what we hear. And so that is something that if we want to improve the generational gap, if we want to make sure AI adoption is structured better, if we want to improve people's perception of returning to office, all of that goes back to this sense of freedom and understanding that as a fundamental right, understanding that compassion is something that we need to focus on, understanding that we need to be really thinking about being open again. None of those big problems that we're constantly talking about ad nauseum that we can't solve, none of those problems will be solved unless we start to think of what is the barrier that we keep hitting with people's subconscious behavior. They don't even know that this is part of what they're doing and why they're resisting. But the more we can understand that, have open conversations about it, the more that we can be enlightened, and then leaders can actually break down those barriers.
Where can people learn more about you and about your book?
Jennifer-Moss.com. Everything's there. My books and a lot of the things that I write for Harvard Business Review are there too, and even just my musings. So if anyone wants to go into that rabbit hole of my musings, they're more than welcome to waste their time there. But yeah, you can just go to the website.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show to talk about this.
It's always such a pleasure. I can't wait for the next book, which is a total lie. I'm taking a break, but then we can talk again.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.